Okay, we're going to get started now. Hello, everyone. My name is Ore Kolade, and I'm the technical manager for this session today on food environments and markets, chaired by Jess Fanzo. Thank you for taking part in the ANH Academy Week, and we look forward to a robust and interactive session today. A quick reminder that everything you might need to access the conference materials and program can be found on the ANH Academy website. So before Jess takes the conversation forward, I have a few technical announcements to make. I'm sure that if you've attended previous sessions, you've heard this before, but please bear with me. So first of all, today's session will be recorded and posted on the ANH Academy website sometime next week so that you can refer back to it. Second, you'll notice that all participants have been muted, but please introduce yourselves using the chat function. Let's know your name, where you're joining from, and the organization that you work with. You can access the chat box by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We encourage you to share your webcam video feed during the session if you don't have bandwidth issues. If you prefer not to, you can put on a profile picture if you're logged on into your own Zoom account. If your connection gets patchy, we do recommend that you turn off your video. Later in the session, we will open up the conversation with a Q&A session. If you have questions, we invite you to raise them at this time during the session in the chat box function. And if we have time, we will have participants raise their hands at the end so that they can speak out their questions. Lastly, if at any point you experience technical issues, please check your audio settings and your internet connection. You can always try to reconnect to the session using the same Zoom link. If you have a technical question, please send me a private message using the chat box. All right, thanks everyone, and over to you, Jess.
Great, thank you, Ore. Thanks everyone for joining us. It looks like we have a great group of people who have come online, and we hope you stay for the full hour. I also hope you had an opportunity to look at the 4 presentations that are available online. If you didn't, please check them out after. They're worth the time, and you can watch them at your own pace. You can pause and look at data a little bit more carefully. My name is Jess Fanzo. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University at the School of Public Health, the Berman Institute of Bioethics, and the NHTSA School of International Studies. It is a real pleasure to chair this panel of 4 stellar scientists doing really interesting work on food environments and what that means for diets and nutrition. I'm going to introduce the 4 panelists. And each will present for about 5 minutes for those of you who didn't really have a chance to look at those videos. And then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So please put your comments, questions in the chat, and we'll try to get through all of them in the hour. So first we'll have Anjali Rao. She is an Amana postdoc fellow, and she's at the Center for Chronic Disease Control in India. And she will be talking about, looking at food environments and their association with body mass index in adults in India. Next, we have Chrissy Thakwalaka. She's the deputy director at the Chancellor College at the University of Malawi. And she did a really interesting study looking at the drivers of food choice among overweight women and children in Malawi, which I was really interested in seeing from the perspective of the double burden. Giacomo Zanello, he's a lecturer in food economics and health at the University of Reading in the UK. He will be presenting his work on rural transformation and the double burden of malnutrition among rural youth in low and middle income countries. Really fascinating work that he's been doing. And last is Ramya Ambakapathy, who is a research associate at Purdue University in Indiana, and I proudly can say a former graduate of Johns Hopkins. I've known Ramya for a while, so it's really great to see her. And she did a fascinating study, again, looking at food environments and their influences on household food purchase patterns and nutrition status in Dar, Tanzania. So welcome everyone. It'll be a really fun hour that we'll spend together. And we'll start off with Anjali, and she'll be presenting for 5 minutes on her work. And Anjali, I'll let you know when time is up.
Thanks. I hope I'm audible. So I joined ANH as a Imana Fellow and now presenting my work on the Uday follow-up, which has been conducted in north and south of India. So today I'm going to talk about association of the food environment with body mass index among the adults who were surveyed during a community-based survey in North and South India. And the study was done by CCDC and Public Health Foundation, New Delhi. I'm going to present the results only for Sonipat, North India today. So just to give a background, as you are aware, food environment has been studied recently because of its connection with overweight and obesity, but most of these studies are from the developed countries and very few are from the developing countries like India. Uday follow-up studied the food environment in Sonipat, which is in north of India, as well as in Vizag, which provided us opportunity to study the association between food environment and obesity and undernutrition and the overall body mass index of the adults. So this was a cross-sectional survey which was conducted among adults about 30 years of age, and they were measured from rural and urban areas of Sonipat, Haryana, which is in north. For socio-demographic characteristics, their consumption of fruits and vegetables, physical activity, and body size. We classified the participants into 5 categories of body mass index as underweight, normal weight, overweight, using Asian cutoffs, overweight, and obesity. And food environment we measured as number of outlets per 1,000 households in a ward, which is the area selected in urban region, and gram panchayat, which is the rural part. So healthy outlets were included those selling staples, dairy, non-veg products, as well as fruits and vegetables. While unhealthy outlets included those selling the out-of-home food, mainly fried, bakery, sweets, salty. So while checking these associations, we had additional controlling variables such as sex, urban rural place of residence, wealth index, fruit and vegetable intake, and activity. We studied around 6,000 people from Sonipat. Half of them were from urban, half from rural, and half of them were women. And food environment was studied in 12 wards in urban and 29 gram panchayats in rural Haryana. This belonged to like around 10,000 households from urban and 10,000 from rural. Just to give a background about socio-demographic profile, their mean age was between 47 to 50 years. Women proportion of illiteracy was higher among women. If we look at the occupation, most of them were homemakers, and most of the men were involved in they were trained workers or employed. When we looked at the household wealth index, which is an indicator of socio-economic status, the household index was higher among the urban participants in comparison with rural. If we look at the fruit and vegetable intake among the participants, the intake of more than 5 servings was higher. It was higher proportion of urban men and women had more than 5 servings of fruits and vegetables. And when we look at the physical activity, it was rural men who were involved in the heavy activity, which is more than 6 minutes. The proportion was higher among the rural men. If we look at their body mass index, proportion of underweight was higher among the rural, while overweight and obesity proportion was higher among the urban participants. This slide basically shows the food access in urban and rural Sonipat, and we divided the the density into tertiles, low, mid, high. So the graph shows proportion of participants who had access to unhealthy food and healthy food. And as we can see, the proportion of participants having higher access to unhealthy food was higher in the urban regions, while the proportion of participants having access to healthy food was higher in the rural. We studied association between the food environment and the body mass index using multivariate analysis, and we could find that those who have higher access to unhealthy food had higher likelihood of having BMI in the overweight and obese category. The other confounders which we could be seen were location, being a female, having higher wealth index. On the other hand, there was a borderline association between BMI from the underweight category and access to healthy food. It was inverse association, and the other confounder was wealth index. So overall, our study shows that the food impacts the BMI. And I would like to thank the Uday study funders, participants, collaborators, Eli Lilly and Chef's study, which supported us. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, next we're going to move on to Chrissy from University of Malawi, and you have 5 minutes, and I'll keep time.
Right, hi everyone. This is Chrissy Takwalakwa from Malawi, presenting on drivers of food choice among overweight women and children in Malawi. And this study was done by the University of Malawi in collaboration with RTI International and Harvard University. So just a little background for Malawi. In Malawi, about 21% of women and 5% of children under 5 are either overweight or obese. And for our recent strategic plan, there's a target to reduce overweight by 5%. But what we have now is a lack of evidence for us to reach that goal. So this study was done there to better understand food choices and to look at the diet and food choice by urban and rural location, and also by season. So in this study, we enrolled women from the central part of Malawi in 2 districts, in Lilongwe and Kasungu. And these mothers, we had mothers and children that were in 2-3 mother-child diets. So in the first mother-child diet, we had overweight mothers and overweight children. The other group, we had an overweight mother and a normal weight child. The third group, we had a normal weight mother and an overweight child. So all this we did to compare dietary intake of those mother-child pairs in those groups, and also to explore a comprehensive set of predictors of dietary intake and to understand drivers of food choice. So we assessed dietary intake using a quantitative food frequency questionnaire. And we also had to assess some other factors like the socioeconomic factors, gender, and preferences, body size preferences that you'll see later on. So these are the factors that we looked at, like the structure and socioeconomic factors, looking at the distance to markets, household assets, number of household members, and we also looked at gender factors, taste preferences, and cognitive factors. For the quantitative food frequency questionnaire, we had a list of 147 individual foods, and the mothers were asked to sort these food items into groups where they rarely eat the food, they occasionally ate the food, or they frequently ate the food in the last 7 days. So for those that they frequently ate in the last 7 days, we further asked them how many times in the last 7 days and how much they ate at each sitting, and then how were the food prepared. And this was done for both the mother and the child. Now, looking at what we found from the dietary intake, we saw that for the mothers, the mother-child diets where the child was overweight, the mothers obtained more percentage of calories from carbohydrates and less percentage from fats. And we also observed that they ate more grains, these mothers, as compared to where we had a normal weight child. And for the children where the child was overweight, we also saw this a similar trend where we had a higher percentage of calories obtained from carbohydrates and a lower percentage from fat, and also a lower intake of oil and fat. Now, this table shows us the predictors of food group consumption by mothers in the dry season. So the red shows a negative association and the green is a positive association. So as you can see, for the number of household assets, the number of household assets, use of transport to the market versus walking, and where in the families where they would purchase special foods for the children, and also they had an amount used to buy special food for the children, we see that those had a positive association with the different types of foods, as you can see in the chart. And for the children, a similar assessment was also done. And for the children, you see like child age emerging as the most common factor that predicted food group consumption. And we also see down there, mother's taste preference also affecting. And again, where the mother perceives overweight or obese as healthy size for the child, you see how it negatively affects the intake of dairy. So those were the most common factors that we found as predictors of food consumption. So in summary, we found that the key drivers of food choice in those mother-child diets were socioeconomic factors, body size preferences, and taste preferences. So as a recommendation, we said the government of Malawi can use the findings to develop food policies and to emphasize, so we can also emphasize on the positive factors that are associated with consumption, and also look at the negative factors and work around it so that we can help Malawi as a nation. And this study was supported by the UK government's Department for International Development, Bill and Melinda Gates, and it was managed by the University of South Carolina and Arnold School of Public Health. Thank you.
Great, great. Okay, next we have Giacomo Zanello from the University of Reading. And Giacomo, 5 minutes. I'll raise my hand at 4.5. Yeah? All right,
thank you very much. I'm going to share a few slides to support my presentation. I hope that you can see them. So thank you everyone. My name is Giacomo Zanello and I'm presenting this work on behalf of a series of different co-authors from various institutions, both at Reading, Imperial College, UNICEF, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So what we are doing in this work and where it started. The work born on the recognition that currently we know fairly little about the way in which economic and social changes in rural areas are contributing to shape nutrition among youth and adolescents. If we want to better understand the nutritional behavior and outcome among those specific age group and in rural areas, we need to know a little bit more how rural transformation, which I will define a little bit later, actually can have an effect on the nutritional behavior and outcomes. So what we are doing in this work? In this work, we use a descriptive approach to examine the association between the trends in rural transformation and the emergence of the double burden of malnutrition. Specifically, we focus on thinness and overweight and obesity. Our age group focus is on adolescent and the youth, as I mentioned. For rural transformation, we intend all the processes of change in rural areas that are due to the development processes. How do we do that? We combine a couple of historical data series from two different sources. From NCD risk, which is which capture nutritional data from adolescent and young people from 10 to 19 years old. And we combine them with the FAOStat data that capture rural transformation. In total, we have around 72 low-middle income countries. In terms of methodology, we use what we call Preston curves, which are a non-parametric approach that allow to statistically capture the empirical cross-sectional relationship between different data sets. In our case, we will have rural transformation and the prevalence of undernutrition or overweight. I'm going to share with you just one of the results, and I will talk through the other results, just to give a little bit an intuition on how our empirical approach works. In here, we have a graph. On the left-hand side, we have underweight. On the right-hand side, we have overweight. On the x-axis, on the bottom, we have agriculture value added per worker, which is a proxy that we use for rural transformation. In the graph that we are going to see, all the green dots and the green line, we refer to the data of the 1975, which is the first data point we have in our series. And the purple dots and purple line refer to the data from the 2015. So in the case of undernutrition, underweight, we see how the blue line, the purple line is below the green line, showing how the data from 2015, there has been insignificant changes in prevalence of underweight for the same level of rural transformation between the two different time series. However, the changes reduces at the higher level of rural transformation. So here on the right-hand side of the line, if you see, they are almost touching themselves, meaning that in 1975 and 2015, at the higher level of rural transformation, actually the changes in the underweight were not significantly different for the same level of rural transformation. On the right-hand side, we see the overweight, and we see a fairly opposite trend at the higher level. At the higher level of rural transformation, the changes is much more significant for in 2015. So we do the analysis for different age group and different gender, sex, male and female. And what we observe is a very similar trend, in a sense that rural transformation have a quite large effect on the increase in overweight and obesity. What do we learn with this? We see how rural transformation can have both a positive and negative impact. And so we argue about the policies that can make these changes and this process both youth and nutritional sensitive. So thank you so much for your attention, and Jess, I give you back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Giacomo. I think I really encourage you all to, again, look at the videos so you can spend a bit more time with the data, particularly for Giacomo's, because he had a lot more data that he didn't show in this presentation that gives a rich picture of their study. Okay, last speaker is Ramya, who I introduced earlier. And Ramya, you've got 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for some of the really interesting questions coming in.
Thank you, Jess. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. I don't know which screen you guys are able to see. I'm gonna try to put it in PowerPoint presentation mode. Okay. Yeah. So we did a study looking at food environment influences, particularly on purchase patterns, diets, and nutritional status. It's set in peri-urban Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The major aim was to characterize the food environment in its entirety, and particularly the informal and the semi-formal vendors that are typically not characterized. So we wanted to capture these folks, and then we wanted to create a summary metrics and then see how it relates to various household nutrition outcomes. This is set in Diet Choices Positive Living, or the DECIDE study, which is funded by the Drivers of Food Choice grants, and it's looking at food choice and environment among families living person living with HIV. So we categorized vendors by into three main categories, by whether the physical location and if they're present in the consistent location daily. And then we also geotagged them and collected a variety of other information like food groups, food items, whether it was a sit down, bakery, cafe, like variety of different typologies. And then we mapped. So we did a food environment census. So meaning we captured all the vendors in our study area, which is about 6,627 vendors. And you can see that, 60% of them is semi-formal and informal food vendors. And then also that the main sources of green leafy vegetables are from these vendors. And then we created some summary metrics. So this is this is like density, dispersion, and diversity. So these are inspired by landscape ecology. Density is the most common one, and we saw an earlier presentation talk about that too. It's just a count of different vendors, and you could have like different specific food item, but you could also have food group level. So it's just a count of vendors. And dispersion is metric is more like a cluster. People also call this hotspots, like a lot of vendors occurring at the same spots. And then the third metric we created is diversity and dominance, which captures variety and evenness by the type of vendor. And I think we focus on more, I'll talk a little bit about why we focus more on the vendor typology as opposed to food group typology in a bit. And then so the households were geotagged and then the vendors were geotagged. So we were able to create those summary food environment metrics for each household. So here's just an example looking at the median green leafy vegetable vendors at different distances. So if in the first 300 vendors, median is about 6. And then if you include the first 1,000 meters as a buffer region, you have about 69 vendors who sell green leafy vegetable. So very, very dense peri-urban kind of setting. And then we wanted to compare those household food environment metrics to the household nutrition outcomes. So a typical participant in the DECIDE study was women about 40 years of age, and they've been diagnosed with HIV about 4 years ago. So this is a PL-HIV population. I just want to say, mention that. And then our selected main outcomes was looking at food purchase in the last 7 days, particularly vegetables, and 71% of our households did say they bought that. And then the energy intake was around 2,700 calories, and then body mass index rated about a third of the population were overweight or obese. 10% were underweight. So now I'm showing you the results of the logistic regression and on the regular regression, adjusting for a variety of individual and household level demographics. This is just the density, and we see this really nice pattern that the greater density of vegetable vendors within 500 meters increases the likelihood of purchasing vegetable. And this effect is even greater when vendors are found closer to home. We also saw that it nicely translated into reduced intake of energy. You can see here it's 50 to 100 calories lower. Then we also did another model that I haven't showed here where we adjusted for body weight, and we still see the same significant pattern. And then I'm showing you some results on looking at the nutritional status at 200 meters and 1,000 meters, comparing the three main metrics: density, dispersion, diversity. We see some with body mass index, it's very, very small. And then we see some diversity affecting waist to hip ratios. Again, it's very small. So in summary, we created these metrics, and we find that it's associated with increased purchase of vegetables and reduced energy intake. We want to explore some of the geospatial variation. We want to explore other food purchase patterns and diets as well, and then identifying intervention points at the purchase level. I'm done.
Great. Thank you, Ramya. Thanks to all four of you for fantastic presentations, really fascinating research. I think this really shows that the food environment research space is really expanding. And as Anjali had said, the dearth of information on low-income country food environments is really key. And I think there was a lot of really fascinating work within this body looking at double burden impacts, rural transformation impacts, how it impacts children, adolescents, mothers. So let's open it up for questions. And I first want to go back to Anjali. We had two questions that somewhat relate, maybe not. And Anjali, hopefully you can answer both of these. And then we'll ask some questions to Chrissy, then Giacomo, and then Ramya. And then I want to ask some broader questions around food environment research if we can as well. So let's see how far we get. So Anjali, there was two questions. One was around, does your data provide any evidence of a nutrition transition, which India is going through, but how does your data demonstrate that nutrition transition dynamics? How is that happening? And a question from Shiva Bandari of what can be the reasons that you see more women who are overweight, obese than men in both rural and urban settings? So could you take on those two questions, Anjali? And of course, be somewhat brief so we can get to lots of questions.
Sure, thanks, Jessica. Yeah, so about the first question, we don't have information regarding transition as such, but if we look at the number of unhealthy shops and healthy shops, so if you're talking in terms of whether there is a shift from healthy food to unhealthy food, we can see that as the number of outlets for unhealthy food were higher even in the rural areas. And in our data, though I have considered most of the grocery shops or as the healthy ones, we can find that they are equally selling the unhealthy food, like chips and everything is easily available. So in those terms, we can see that there are a number of unhealthy shops which are more, which might be indicating also the demand for them, though we don't have actual data collected about their intake. If you're talking about serial measurements and transition in that term, then we don't have such data to support the evidence. About the second question about overweight and obesity in women is higher. So if we look at even at the national data, we can find the percent of women in overweight and obesity is increasing, and our figures are showing similar thing. Unfortunately, there was no intake data or for all the foods which will allow me to see the associations. But as you can see from the occupation, most of the women were housemakers, and they might be reflecting lower physical activity and other indicators. But our data doesn't have other data to check the associations as such. It goes with the national parameters. Yeah, thanks. I hope I have addressed both the questions. So
yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Christy, you had lots of questions. So let's try to tackle, I'm going to ask you three of them. And one of the other questions was a policy one, which we'll save for a second set. So you had some method questions in some of your results. So from Fanny, she asked, it's surprising to see the association between higher education and increased sweet consumption in children. Any thoughts on that? Dominic asked, could you describe a bit more about the metrics used to measure taste preferences? I'm very curious about that as well. And Lygia asked, how did you determine the 147 food items selected for pile sorting? So clearly you've got some researchers on the line here. So could you take those three questions, and I can repeat them if you need that.
Thank you so much. So for the first question on higher education and sweet consumption, I think for the sweet consumption, for those women that have higher education, they have more cash and they can purchase anything they want. So for the sweets, it's like one of those things that is associated with having enough cash. When you don't have cash, you don't go for sweets, you just go for the necessities, the basics. So that was the common thing for the women that had higher education. And for the second one was on the taste preference. We had a 5-point hedonic scale, which ranged from dislike very much to like very much. So each food we had to ask the mother to place herself where she was. The third one is on the 147 foods that the mother were asked to sort. For that one, we collected all the foods that were common in the study areas and also from the food composition table for Malawi.
Great. And you had one question around policy. Could you give an example of one or two policies or programs that are practical to start with in Malawi based on your findings? That was your final recommendation that you need to work with the government. What would you recommend? You had 2 minutes with the Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Health. What are you going to recommend?
Yeah, oh, thank you so much. So for now, I think I wouldn't go straight into the policies, but programs, where I would look into the messages that are to be given to people out there on the unhealthy food consumption, or how the quantities that one can eat per sitting. So for now, it will be more of programs than policies. Because as you saw, the recommendation was to redo this, because this is the first result that we have in Malawi. So the recommendation was to do this again to see the effectiveness before we move on the policy.
Fantastic, great. Okay, Giacomo, you had a couple of questions. I was curious to know why you chose the indicator of rural transformation to be the ag value added per worker, as opposed to maybe other rural transformation indicators like people moving away from agriculture into more of the middle of the supply chain, or moving towards services and manufacturing in these hinterland, peri-urban spaces. So just curious to know why that. And you had another question from Shiva. Shiva is very inquisitive. If I'm correct, you have defined rural transformation as level and speed. What do you think the role of social and technological transformation, which are more common in rural areas, on the double burden of malnutrition? And can you please explain more? So a little bit kind of similar questions. So yeah.
No, those, thank you so much. Those are very great questions, and something that we have been thinking about, and probably we need to think a little bit more on this. It's always a compromise in terms of what you can proxy based on what you want to do, and in terms of availability of data. We try different things, but there are always several gaps in terms of the span of the time series, or the breadth of the countries that you can cover. And we found the agriculture value added per worker to be the kind of best compromise in those terms. It's also the kind of variable that, for example, IFAD used in the rural report. So it's a kind of, we could back up on that. In terms of Shiva's question, to what extent we can capture social and technological transformation, again, a very good question. We would think that agricultural value added per worker somehow could embed to some extent technological transformation as well, in terms of more productivity, maybe higher value crops and so on. So definitely something that we might need to think more, possibly try to provide a different analysis with different proxies in a way that they can provide a fuller picture. So a very good point.
Great. Thanks, Giacomo. Rambe, you had a couple of questions. One was on, and Anjali might want to comment on this one after you comment on your questions. What do you think explains the relationship between proximity and density in dietary intake? And what are the mechanisms to explain that? And I actually had a question of the difference between density and dispersion. Another question came in from Ankita of how were the vendors defined? Just vendors for green leafy vegetables, or vegetable vendors more generally? Yeah. And then following that, Lydia Omaria. Omari, I'm sorry, I'm not saying your name correct, Lydia. Sorry, typical New Yorker here. Could you expand on the implication of your study and how you see the findings informing policy and programs? She says, for example, I see that green leafy vegetables is dominated by informal vendors. Therefore, although food safety calls for regulation, could such policy changes impact availability of nutrient-rich foods in this setting? So a little bit on methods and how you define things and some of the mechanisms, and then some policy questions. And I'm happy to repeat them. And then maybe Anjali, you can come in on the density as well.
Yeah, these are great questions. So the first one was the relationship and some mechanism. So we saw that density, I mean, at least closer to you does affect like your food environment, like having availability does affect your food purchase patterns. So, and I'm going to look at it in terms, we have quantitative dietary intake, so I can actually look at it in terms of grams of food group consumed. So I didn't present this. So I think some of the mechanism is that for healthier, this is just, I'm just, making a guess, educated guess here. For healthier food patterns, I do think being close to the house will have a larger effect, and we see that. And I think for unhealthy, like sweetened snacks or sugary soda, and I've done analysis and I haven't shown it here, is that it doesn't matter. Like people will go at lengths to get the sweets and sugary soda. But for healthier pattern, I think the proximity is the key. That's just what I think we're starting to see some data on that, and I'm hoping we could present some of that in the future. And then, and to Ankita's question, how were vendors defined? We did a food environment census, meaning all the food vendors, prepared, fresh, produce, everything, shops. So it included everybody. And then we asked like what foods they sold. So the green leafy, the vegetable, like the green leafy vendors could be formal, informal, and semi-formal, but based on the whole data that we see, the semi-formal and informal vendors are the major source of green leafy vegetables. So I hope that answers, and I'm happy to answer in detail about the whole tool and methodology. It was a walking survey, so they had the ODK in their hand, and they just kind of walked and did the Transact survey. And they went through every single alleyways and big streets and major streets and everything. And then, okay, so that's related to the next question, I guess, on policy and programs. So I have thought at different levels about this. So at the vendor level, I know, so they're not typically taken into account, and they're typically regulated in theory, but not really in action. And sometimes they're like, it depends upon what government they are, they could be persecuted, and it's a very contentious topic. I do think they serve a purpose, and I talked about this in the learning lab as well. I think the corporations are using these mobile vendors and like training them, giving them badges and coolers so they can sort of increase access to these processed foods while people wait in the commute and whatever. So I think they have a lot of potential in terms of convenience to people. And I think supporting them and having a framework that really, like, it's kind of a side hustle. Like, it's a gig economy, and no one's going to be thinking about, oh, I need a badge, oh, I need a license. It's just something that, okay, I need money, this is how I'm going to do it. So how can we support that in like regulatory framework? I think that's probably the key. Food safety is an issue. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Jess, but I do want to mention that the majority of the mobile vendors who sell the nutrient-rich foods, it's not very expensive. So these are women. So women sell majority of the green leafy vegetables. So thinking about the whole gender aspect is also another dimension that I didn't have time to get into, but it's also a key aspect here. I don't know if I really missed anything.
Great. Anjali, did you want to ask?
Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah. So firstly, I would like to address about the methods thing. So though it looks very, though definition wise, we could clearly define the healthy and unhealthy, when it comes to measurements, it's not that healthy because it is not that easy, sorry. So because actually, if we look at all the shops in a developed country like India, every commodity is sold at different place. So there may be grocery shops selling all the unhealthy plus healthy food. In some villages, there were places where they didn't have access to vegetables at all, Or there were shops, if you look at the rural areas, milk selling or non-vegetarian selling was not a commercial activity. So in those cases, we had a issue how to measure, because it was not identified as a shop or outlet. So these are the methodological issues when we measure the number of shops or their distance. So here in Uday, we measured both number of shops as well as distance, and I yet have to analyze the distant data because it considers both straight line as well as radial distance. And there are publications in this domain which have shown that density and distance both are important factors. It's actually fascinating to see that if we look at the outlets and BMI and they are associated, that gives a hope to think from the policy point of view, that we can think about the channels that can be used for introducing healthy environment. So I have, for my Imana work, I worked in Maharashtra, in India, on healthy, unhealthy density, and that's published early this year. There also we found that healthy and unhealthy density is associated with BMI. Considering that there is a double burden of diseases in a country like India, we have to use these channels very carefully and try to make more healthy food environment, introduce more healthy food environment, because the competition is very high. If we look at the market policies, the unhealthy food is very easily available. The cost is low, so there are many attractions. So from point of view of policy, there can be, and we have seen in our data that wealth index or socioeconomic status is one of the important co-variables in while operating between the density of shops and obesity, overweight, as well as undernutrition. So while thinking from policy point of view, all these factors need to be considered. There can be more Indian government tried to introduce the sin tax in between on the aerated drinks or fast food. So policies like that will be more helpful. But while working on those policies, we have to consider that undernutrition without increasing the burden of overnutrition or obesity or related NCDs. So these are the points from my side. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask two questions and maybe combine a question from someone else to Giacomo. Emily Vivian had asked about managing rural transformation. How do we manage rural transformation in ways that protect health and nutrition and a variety of other social determinants of youth, and I would argue others, women, marginalized populations, disadvantaged populations, in countries that are transforming? And I want to have Giacomo start, but I want the whole panel to answer this question. So think about food environments. We don't want food environments to look like the United States, right? Around the world. So as countries are transforming, what can we do to protect the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, and shape food environments towards those that are healthier? I hope the whole panel, I'd love to hear from each of you. And I want to end, if we have time, around what do you feel as researchers on the ground? What are some of the challenges you face with food environments? Lack of tools, lack of methods, lack of, whatever it is. So I hope we can end with that, because I think there's a lot of researchers on the call who are working on food environments. It'd be good to get your perspectives on what are some of the challenges in doing food environment research. So let's start first with the transformation question. How do we avoid catastrophic burden, multiple burdens, lots of obesity, unhealthy food environments, rural transformation from going in the directions we don't want them to go? Giacomo, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. So I think not an easy question, and I think there are two different dimensions, and somehow what I can do is provide a kind of a very general overview. in a sense that there is a macro level policies and factors that affect food environment, and there are micro level factors affecting food environment. In general, I would argue that we shouldn't focus just on food supply and food trade, on what has been traded, but also how food is distributed and marketed, and to whom. All the kind of analysis that we have been listening today on food environment at micro level try to answer exactly that questions, and I think are critical to know more about that. More at major drivers of rural transformation, all foreign, for example, FDIs, foreign direct investment in agriculture and the food sector have influence in the food environment, trade regime as well have an impact on food environment. And of course, trying to focus on who the specific age group and the specific people, of course, the impact will be different. More talking again at macro level and from a policy point of view, something that we've been seeing increasingly in many countries is a combination of fiscal policies such as taxation, so taxing, for example, unhealthy food, and the regulation of marketing activities. So you cannot market a certain kind of food. So those are the kind of more at macro level factors that influence direct or indirect food environments. Plus all the kind of effect that can have a micro level that have been highlighted in all those very interesting researches today.
Great. Chrissy, you want to come in here?
Yes, thank you. I think he's talked about much of what I also was looking at, but I'm looking at like a scenario for Malawi where undernutrition has been overemphasized for so long. So much so that people's ideas are focused on what foods can we eat to get bigger. So here we have a role to play to take back the message to the people so they know that it's not just about getting bigger, but it's about healthy food. So it's about how we package our messages to the communities out there. And also we have issues of indicating on the package of the foods, like what is the nutritive value of the food. And that one is not very well controlled, so much so that even for me, I can wake up today and make some energy foods and I'll be able to sell out there. So we still also have that role to look into that, for the government, working with the government to control on what foods are being produced in the markets and who are getting those foods and what do they need to know for those particular foods that are out there in the markets. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, label transparency and helping consumers make the right choices, so key. Anjali, you want to come in on this question around transformation, food environment, nutrition transition?
Right. So taking from the points which are made by both of them, at the micro level, probably more awareness for the healthy food and availability of safe food might be an option. There are some experiments like farmers markets, which improve the access to healthy food directly from farmers at lower costs. Such experiments need to be tested whether they are effective. At the macro level, I feel there need to be more policies about making healthy food available, making safe food available, and putting up tax on the unhealthy food. Certain initiatives like food labeling will make the consumers more aware about what they are eating. So it needs to be an overall comprehensive approach rather than just at the micro or macro level. It works better. Thanks.
Hey. Yeah, thank you. And Ramya, I'm going to have you answer that question, but I also want you to start the next set of questions that we'll do a round robin on, and it's what's missing from food environment research, or what are the challenges that you face doing food environment research? Is it tools, what is it? So you could take on both of
The
those.
first one, yeah, to focus on the micro level. I think for the biggest challenge is that people don't have time. It does not matter what socioeconomic status you are, whether you're rural or urban, women are time impoverished, and they are the ones making these food choice decisions, food purchasing patterns, and cooking and preparing. So having like healthier foods at different budgets is the key. And I think we don't have to think about a lot or trying to create experiments. Like Taiwan is a great case study. We can just go do case studies of Taiwan and how they were able to do that and bring some of the lessons back, so we don't have US everywhere. That's a short answer. Just time, ultimately. Let's just be real. We cannot cook every day. It's, you know, we need to have these available at a different budget. And then the challenges. Okay, so I thought a lot about this. First is standardizing definitions, and actually, Jess, like I saw the paper written by you and the co-author Shauna Downs. Based on that, there's a different definition. I was thinking about it, like we created these like a year or 2 years ago, and then it just falls in different, like what you call informal, I would call semi-formal. You know, so standardizing definition is the key. And then also spatial sampling method. When I first started understanding how to do spatial mapping or sampling, and I thought about reaching out to some of my old teachers actually at Hopkins, but we ended up doing a census because we're just like, whatever, let's just do census. We're not going to try to understand that. So kind of like spatial sampling strategies that could be borrowed from other literature. And then finally, I think like if we have enough interest, like funding is going to be the big thing. Funding research for metrics, funding research for indicators like this, and testing it in different LMIC contexts, including the informal and semi-formal vendors. At least in the East Africa context, there's still like the major intersection where people interact between food environment and household. So that's I think is the key area we need to focus on.
Great. Giacomo, you want to come in on this? I know your paper wasn't squarely on food environment, but very much touches on it.
Yeah, what I can add and very much build on Ramaya points, it's, I'm thinking more in terms of where we are and where we started. In a sense, if you think about 4 or 5 years ago, research on food environment were minimal. Instead, now there is a lot of going on. And I think what will be needed soon is a kind of a synthesis of what we have learned in this first wave of research, and trying to take stock of the situation in a way that then, okay, what is the next things that we don't know yet? So maybe my contribution would be very much try to take stock of this first wave of research and trying to learn from them to provide a direction for the second wave of research in food environment.
Great. Chrissy, food environment research, particularly in the context of low income settings, how the challenges around that.
Yeah, so one of the challenges has been already highlighted on resources, and we look at funding, where you are limited to conduct some kind of research because of what budget you have. So that's one of the challenges that we usually face. And also the tools that we use, because most of the tools have been tried in high-income countries, and we have to try them in low-income countries. And in most cases, what we get is not what we expect to have. So that's another area that needs more input if we are to produce very good results from environment research.
Great. And Anjali, last comment.
Yeah, so again, as said by her, most of the methods are tested in the developed countries, and in country like India, where every commodity, every food is sold at different outlet, it is difficult to do just geo mapping or measuring the space in the supermarket and associating it with the outcomes. So we need the community specific or country specific. Even when I looked at the data from South India and North India, the picture is very different. So we need more community specific tools and that is one of the challenge. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your fantastic contributions. We tried to get to most of the questions, but if you have outstanding questions, I'm sure none of these panelists would mind if you reached out to them to inquire more about their really interesting studies. So please look at their videos, reach out to them. Just 2 quick plugs. We've launched something called the Food Systems Dashboard, foodsystemsdashboard.org, which has lots of data. We have some food environment data, but it'd be great to see more. So I encourage you all to go there, critique it, use it, become a partner, upload data onto it. So we're really encouraging people to go to that and use it. Also, I'm the editor-in-chief for the Global Food Security Journal, and we're always looking for more food environment publications. One of the first ones we had was from the London School, Chris Turner, who did a food environment paper that probably many of you have read. We'd love to see more. So consider submitting your work to that journal in the future. Thank you all for spending an hour with us, particularly to Ore and the panelists, really, and those that worked with us, Phil and Dominic, and I think it was Emily. Was it Emily? Thank you so much for spending the hour with us. Be safe, stay healthy. We're in the middle of a pandemic, wear your masks, and hopefully we'll see each other someday in person again in a couple of years.
Just to echo Jess, thank you all very much. And also, if you have time, in about 30 minutes, we've got our social hangouts. We've got the African Nutrition Society and Friends and Family, the Manor Fellowship's Q&A, and Animal and Plant Source Fund. So join us if you can. Thank you so much for joining. All right, bye.